In 1919, after 4 long, devastating years of war, the world tried to stitch itself back together with the Treaty of Versailles. As most of you know, that treaty was less than successful. And particularly relevant for us, it failed to prevent a Second World War. The issue is, can we somehow settle the Second World War so we don't have a third? Now, negotiations for the end of World War II actually begin before the war actually ends in February of 1945. So this is another one of those conferences where the big three meet at the Soviet resort city of Yalta. There are no Axis powers to negotiate with because remember, Roosevelt has basically demanded unconditional surrender. So it doesn't really matter what their opinion is. So Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meet to literally redraw the face of the planet to a certain extent. Now, it is agreed at Yalta that Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones after the war, and that the USSR will eventually fight Japan so long as it gets to occupy Manchuria. Except there was a tiny little problem. So by this point, Soviet forces have occupied a lot of Eastern Europe. And it doesn't look like they're going to leave. In fact, you start to see the creation of communist governments where communism isn't even all that popular. And remember that for the United States, we're at war because Germany just declared war on us. For the British go to war over the fate of Eastern Europe because remember, Germany invades Poland in September of 1939. So Winston Churchill is worried that all that's happened in Eastern Europe is that we've traded one mustached dictator for another. Now, as it happens, Stalin kind of dodges this issue or sort of plays it down, but it doesn't really go away. Now, the next conference is in July to August of 1945. By this point, FDR has passed away and he's been replaced by his vice president, Harry S. Truman. At this point, the war in Germany is over. Germany basically gets defeated in May of 1945, but the war against Japan is still going on. So in this particular conference, it is agreed that the Soviet Union will once again fight the Japanese. Final arrangements are made for Germany's division with zones of control that you can see up here. And that Poland gains German territory, that territory right around here. Now, if you remember, Soviet forces control Poland, so it's almost as if you're giving German territory to the Soviet Union at this point. World War II isn't ended by a treaty because the Axis powers just end up surrendering. Germany surrenders in May of 1945, Japan surrenders in August of that same year. So what happens is basically the United States starts kind of restructuring the world in its own image. In October of 1945, you have a successor to the League of Nations that's established, the United Nations, but the big difference between the League of Nations and the United Nations is that not only are the Americans present from the start, they basically build the thing. Americans are the primary authors of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So this is specifically written in response to the horrors of the Holocaust. It protects the rights of civilians, specifically women, children, and also refugees. You can even make the argument that planning for the end of the war begins as early as 1941, before the United States is actually at war with either Germany or Japan. So before America is brought in, he builds up a pretty cozy relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the two obviously see eye to eye on how Hitler is a threat, and Roosevelt is basically waiting for American public opinion to shift so that the United States can get involved in defeating Hitler. So Roosevelt and Churchill agree to meet off the coast of Canada and basically discuss how, even though the United States is not a belligerent in World War II, um, what the world would look like ideally when the war ends. And the byproduct of that meeting, the result of that meeting, is one of the most important documents ever produced for our modern world today, and it's called the Atlantic Charter of 1941. If our modern global system has DNA, this is it. So it does a whole bunch of things. One, it reemphasizes the idea of self-determination. It talks about how the world should embrace things like free trade. And along with self-determination, there's also this stated goal to restore self-government to colonies. So the British are slowly but surely realizing that these colonies are actually netting them economic losses. They're incredibly expensive to maintain, and we've already talked about the growth of nationalistic movements that are pushing for independence after World War I. Like, they haven't gone anywhere. We've already talked about this massive movement that's developing in India. And so the British reluctantly agree to start the process of decolonization. Now, the other country that's also a big colonial power, France, resists that for a fairly long period of time. After the end of World War II, the French will actually fight long and devastating wars in places like Algeria and Vietnam to basically preserve their presence in those colonies. But ultimately, the Atlantic Charter establishes that the age of European empires is over. There are a whole host of reasons for this wave of decolonization. Now, so to a certain extent, it's just the fact that European countries had promised many of their colonies independence as early as World War I, and that hadn't happened. So the expectation is that the European powers would have to make good on their promises. Also, the idea of European or white superiority was already kind of precarious after World War I, but it was absolutely devastated after World War II. We've already mentioned the cost argument, that these colonies were basically netting European powers' losses. The other thing is that a growing urban middle class and growing interest in industrialization took place in other parts of the world, so you begin to see modernization. Also, the trend tends to be towards human rights. We saw that in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And so it's kind of hard to square empires with the idea of human rights. Also is the domino effect. When one colony declares independence, that makes it more likely that other colonies do so as well. Before World War II, there were about 60 to 70 independent sovereign states. After World War II, we start a domino effect where that number almost quadruples, where today, because of decolonization and other things, we have over 195 sovereign independent states. So how did decolonization go? Well, it's a mixed bag. So one criticism that's frequently leveled at European empires like the British is they actually tried to decolonize too quickly. In other words, they made hasty arrangements in their colonies and then sort of just pieced out. So, for example, the British weren't really all that invested in drawing territorial boundaries for their colonies that made sense. Oftentimes, they would make countries where you might have 3 or 4 ethnic groups that are all sort of in conflict with one another. An example of that would be Nigeria, where you have a southern population that is very mercantile and either animistic or Christian, called the Igbo, and in the north part of the country, you have the Yoruba population, which exists in a more desert climate, and they also are predominantly Muslim, and they're not as mercantile. there are tons of problems in Nigeria today because of the fusion of Nigeria with these two very different ethnic groups. You also have, and this will be a problem a little bit later, the fact that there's a push to redistribute land and resources from the colonial setup to a more fair setup. And sometimes this leads new independent governments to adopt either communism or socialism. Also, you don't have the enormous military and economic muscle of the European powers behind these independent countries. So, like under colonial rule, you didn't really have as many regional wars, and famines were actually kind of a mixed bag. But European powers would at least try to prevent famine. And this reduced the likelihood of those two things. But now in these newly independent countries, these regional wars and famines are not as well controlled. Now, on the other hand, you do have populations that are increasing after colonial rule. And by the way, this is kind of happening across the board where the global population will grow, extraordinarily over the succeeding decades and half century. To give you guys an idea, the global population before World War II was about 2 billion. Now, as of 2026, the global population has basically quadrupled to over 8 billion people. So you see population increases across the board, but you especially see it in these former colonies. Europeans had aided with the eradication of diseases, and Europeans had also improved medical treatment, hygiene, and water purification. But again, newly independent nations continue to struggle with becoming economically stable and competitive. These newly independent countries very often had civil wars or wars with their neighbors. And this basically depletes a lot of resources that could have otherwise been used for economic development. These nations also want to complete industrialization, but also struggle doing that. But for these newly independent nations, there's a chill in the air because now that they've escaped colonialism, they have to run from a cold winter. And that is the winter brought about by the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that is where we'll pick up our story next time.